Good evening. He vanished more than 3 years ago, and a body was never found.
Today, Joe Clyde Daniels' father, Joseph, faced a judge and jury charged with murder in the child's death. News Channel 5's Chris Davis begins our team coverage of the trial live from Dickson County. Chris, this is a case that thousands of Tennesseans have been following closely.
Absolutely, Vicki, and we've been waiting for 3 years for this day, for this trial to start. Our day started with opening statements from both the prosecution and defense, and both really zeroed in on what may end up being the key piece of evidence in this trial, the taped confession of Joseph Daniels. Now, that may not be entered and shown to the jury at all if the state can't provide evidence to back up at least some of what's claimed in that confession. However, we did hear from the state today, and they said that they had the evidence to back it up. Meanwhile, the defense is arguing that the whole thing was coerced. Here's what they said.
The proof is going to show that these confessions were voluntarily made, that they were not coerced in any way. In fact, the last two confessions came about from the defendant calling law enforcement. As far from coercion as you can possibly get.
And you're going to hear, in regard to that, how biased this investigation was. The state did not want evidence that my client confessed falsely. They didn't want to know what happened.
Then we heard from 5 different witnesses. The first was Joe Clyde's speech pathologist, who talked about Joe Clyde's sweet personality and the progress he made as he worked on his verbal skills. She also talked about his motor skills, which were evidently just in the first percentile for his age. Joe Clyde's bus driver testified this morning, testified about the morning baby Joe didn't show up for school. And then the state called a 911 operator who spoke to the father, Joseph, during his 911 call. She noticed something about the tone he had on the phone.
Did you find anything odd about this phone call?
He seemed extremely calm.
Last 2 witnesses we just heard from in the last hour were Dickson County Sheriff's deputies. They both responded the morning that Joseph called 911 claiming that his son was missing. One key piece of that testimony was actually from the second deputy we heard from. We actually watched his body camera footage, and in that footage, the prosecution claims you can see Joseph Daniels' car leaving the home. Now, the prosecution is arguing right there that is when Joseph may have left to go dispose of baby Joe's body. The defense is saying, and said at least in the opening statements this morning, that timeline just doesn't make sense. Who would call 911 and then leave to go dispose of a body? The court just wrapped up for the day about 8 minutes ago, so there's a lot for the jury to consider tonight as they head to their hotel and get some dinner. We're going to head home too, and we'll have lots tomorrow as trial begins back tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Reporting live in Charlotte, Chris Davis, News Channel 5.
Chris, thank you. And we have team coverage giving us an in-depth look at this trial every step of the way.
That's right. News Channel 5's Nick Barris, of course, and legal analyst Nick Leonardo. They break down the impact of that testimony that was heard today.
I'm Nick Barris, along with News Channel 5 legal analyst Nick Leonardo. Day 1 of the Joe Clyde Daniels trial. There were 4 witnesses called by the prosecution. But as always, the day started with opening statements. We heard from both sides. Nick, why don't we start first with the prosecution, what you felt they hit home with on their opening?
Well, the prosecution hit home and they gave us an explanation of exactly what they think the evidence is going to show, what happened to Joe Clyde Daniels. And they talked about the fact that there's been several inconsistent stories that have been presented by the defendant.
Yep. I also thought what was very important is that they mentioned for the first time we heard that the brother, the older brother who was in the house of Joe Clyde, they say witnessed what happened. First time we've heard that. And I think there's a possibility he's been subpoenaed. He might end up testifying.
I think he's going to, because we had discussed that. We didn't know if the child overheard something or the child actually witnessed something. In this case, the DA said that the child saw the beating of his brother for what he maintains is about 15 minutes, which is certainly something the child would remember.
If that's true, they're going to call him to corroborate
sure.
the confession, which Joseph Daniels has recanted. All right, as far as the defense, basically they just continue to hammer on the fact that they feel that this confession was coerced and that there is no physical evidence to prove that Joe Clyde is even dead.
And actually, and they're going to say the TBI and the police department didn't do a good job investigating this case.
That they more or less stopped investigating once they had the confession.
That's exactly
right. And that
right.
there were other leads that could have maybe...
And they just didn't pursue those leads.
That's where we stand. They'll be back at it for day 2, the prosecution continuing their case. Now we'll send it back to you in the studio.